The steel-gray waters of the Pacific stretched endlessly beneath Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's flagship, the carrier Akagi, as dawn broke on June 4, 1942. The morning air carried the acrid smell of aviation fuel and the metallic tang of anticipation. Nagumo stood on the bridge, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled by the Imperial Japanese Navy. For aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu cut through the swells, in perfect formation, their flight decks bustling with mechanics making final preparations. The rising sun flags snapped proudly in the Pacific breeze, symbols of an empire that had swept across the ocean like a tsunami of conquest. Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines. The Dutch East Indies all had fallen before the unstoppable might of Japan's combined fleet. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, the man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, moved among the pilots in Akagi's ready room. His eyes gleamed with the same fierce determination that had driven him over Oahu's peaceful morning. The young aviators around him represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation men, who had trained since childhood to die for their emperor. Men whose skill in the cockpit was matched only by their unwavering devotion to Bushido. Today, we finish what we began at Pearl Harbor, Fukuda addressed his pilots, his voice carrying the weight of destiny. The American Pacific Fleet will be crushed, and their fortress at Midway will become another stepping stone in our march across the Pacific. But 300 miles to the northeast, another force was stirring. Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned his remaining Pacific Fleet carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown in a deadly ambush. American codebreakers had cracked Japan's naval cipher, providing Nimitz with detailed knowledge of Japanese plans. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the carrier decks, both fleets remained unaware that they were about to collide in what would become the most decisive naval battle in Pacific history. Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his flight goggles aboard Enterprise, unaware that his squadron would soon hold the fate of the Pacific War in their hands. The American pilots, many of them recent graduates from flight schools, lacked the experience of their Japanese counterparts. But they possessed something equally valuable, a burning desire for revenge against the nation that had attacked their homeland without warning. As radio chatter crackled between the ships and reconnaissance aircraft launched into the morning sky, both fleets prepared for a battle that would test not just naval tactics and pilot skill, but the very soul of two nations locked in mortal combat. The stage was set for an encounter that would shatter Japan's aura of invincibility and mark the beginning of their long retreat across the Pacific. The thunder of aircraft engines would soon replace the gentle sound of waves against steel hulls. At 0 for 30 hours on June 4th, the first Nakajima B-5 Kate bombers lifted off from the heaving deck of the Akagi, their engines straining against the Pacific dawn. The strike force of 108 aircraft, 36 Kates, 36 Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters formed up in the growing light. Their destination the American garrison at Midway, atoll, 600 miles southeast of their current position. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the formation, his bomber heavy with ordnance intended to pulverize the American defenses. Intelligence reports suggested Midway's garrison was formidable, with coastal guns, anti-aircraft batteries, and a significant air component that could threaten the Japanese fleet. The mission was clear: neutralize Midway's ability to launch counterstrikes while Admiral Nagumo's carriers waited for the inevitable American fleet response. As reported by naval historian Gordon Prange in his comprehensive account Miracle at Midway, the Japanese strike achieved tactical surprise against the Midway garrison, but the results were far from decisive. American Marine pilots, flying obsolete Brewster F-2 Buffalo fighters, rose to meet the Japanese formation in what amounted to aerial suicide missions. Captain Marion Carl and his fellow Marines knew their aircraft were outmatched by the nimble Zeros, yet they pressed their attacks with desperate courage. The sky above Midway exploded into a deadly ballet of tracer fire and falling aircraft. Major Lofton Henderson's squadron of Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bombers, attempted to reach the Japanese carriers, but were intercepted by Zero Combat Air Patrol. Henderson himself was shot down, becoming one of the first American casualties of the day, but his sacrifice would later inspire his fellow pilots to extraordinary acts of heroism. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese carriers, Admiral Nagumo faced his first crucial decision. Tomonaga's radio message was clear but troubling. There is need for a second attack wave. Midway's defenses remained largely intact, and American aircraft were still operational. However, Nagumo had kept half his strike aircraft in reserve, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for the expected encounter with American naval forces. The decision that would haunt Japanese naval aviation for generations came at 07:15. Nagumo ordered his reserve aircraft to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for a second strike against Midway on the hangar decks below. Exhausted ground crews began the laborious process of switching ordnance-removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, wheeling up high-explosive weapons, refueling aircraft that had been spotted on deck since before dawn. Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey's Enterprise Air Group was already airborne, flying a search pattern that would bring them into contact with destiny. The American pilots, many flying their first combat mission, navigated by dead reckoning across the featureless Pacific, searching for the Japanese fleet that intelligence had promised would be there. As the morning sun climbed higher, painting the ocean in shades of gold and blue, both fleets moved inexorably toward their appointment with history. The first drops of blood had been spilled over Midway's coral beaches, but the real battle, the encounter that would determine the course of the Pacific War, was yet to begin. Time was running out for both sides. At 07:28, the morning calm aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi was shattered by an urgent message from the cruiser Tone's reconnaissance aircraft. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, in position 10 degrees distance to 140 miles from Midway. Course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Admiral Nagumo's face went ashen as he processed this information. The presence of American surface ships this close to his position meant only one thing: the Pacific Fleet had not been caught sleeping at Pearl Harbor as intelligence had suggested. Worse, if these ships included aircraft carriers, his own fleet was potentially sailing into a trap. The agonizing minutes that followed would be dissected by naval historians. For decades, Nagumo's chief of staff, Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka, argued for immediate action against the American surface force. However, the admiral found himself caught in a tactical nightmare of his own making. His reserve aircraft were in the midst of rearming for the second Midway strike, their decks cluttered with ordnance, fuel lines snaking across the steel plating like deadly serpents. At 07:45, another message arrived that sent shock waves through the Japanese command. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier bringing up the rear. The worst fears of the combined fleet staff were confirmed. They faced not just American surface ships, but enemy carriers capable of striking back. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's Torpedo Squadron 6 had already found the Japanese fleet, their obsolete Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers struggling to maintain formation, as Zero fighters dove on them like hawks on sparrows. The American torpedo attack was a massacre. Lindsay himself was shot down, along with 9 of his 14 aircraft, their torpedoes exploding harmlessly in the Pacific swells, or running wide of their targets. The scene aboard the Japanese carriers during these crucial minutes resembled controlled chaos. Ground crews worked frantically to clear the flight decks, knowing that every minute of delay potentially meant death from American dive bombers. Captain Jisaku Okada of the Kaga shouted orders over the roar of aircraft engines, his voice barely audible above the cacophony of preparation for battle. Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet met an even more devastating fate. Waldron had broken radio silence earlier that morning with a prophetic message. If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. His prophecy proved grimly accurate. Only one of his 15 aircraft survived the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, and Ensign George Gay found himself floating in the Pacific, the sole survivor of his squadron. watching the battle unfold from a front-row seat among the wreckage. The courage of the American torpedo bomber crews, flying obsolete aircraft against impossible odds, achieved something more valuable than tactical success. They drew down the Japanese combat air patrol to sea level, leaving the carriers vulnerable to high-altitude attack. Zero fighters that had been patrolling at 20,000 feet were now engaged in low-level combat. Their pilots focused on the immediate threat rather than scanning the sky for additional American aircraft. Admiral Nagumo finally made his decision at 09:15, suspend the Midway operation and concentrate on the American fleet. But time had become his enemy. The rearming process that had begun over an hour earlier was still not complete, and American reconnaissance aircraft continued to circle his fleet like vultures, reporting his position to their carriers. The stage was set for disaster. At 09:20, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's Enterprise dive bombers were lost, flying at 19,000 feet over the seemingly endless Pacific. McCluskey faced the nightmare of every naval aviator. His fuel was running low, and the Japanese fleet was nowhere in sight. His 37 Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bombers had been searching for over 2 hours, following coordinates that should have led them to Admiral Nagumo's carriers. McCluskey made the decision that would alter the course of the Pacific War. Instead of turning back to Enterprise, he ordered his formation to continue southwest, following the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer that was racing north at maximum speed. The destroyer Arashi, commanded by Captain Yasumasa Watanabe, had been delayed after dropping depth charges on the submarine USS Nautilus, and was now desperate to rejoin the main fleet. The sight that greeted McCluskey's pilots at 09:55 would be etched in their memories forever, for Japanese aircraft carriers steamed in perfect formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. Fuel lines snaked across the decks, ordnance lay stacked in neat piles, and ground crews worked frantically to ready the strike force that would have decimated the American fleet. Attack! Attack! McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio as he pushed his Dauntless into a steep dive toward the carrier Kaga. Behind him, Lieutenant Richard Best's squadron rolled into their attack runs on the flagship Akagi, while the remaining aircraft targeted the carrier Soryu. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise at Pearl Harbor. Now the Americans returned the favor with devastating precision. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson's aircraft was among the first to score a direct hit on Kaga. His 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the flight deck near the island's superstructure, detonating among the aircraft being prepared for launch. Within seconds, the entire forward section of the carrier was engulfed in flames as aviation gasoline ignited. In a series of secondary explosions that could be seen from 20 miles away, simultaneously, Lieutenant Best's bomb found its mark. On Akagi, the explosion occurred near the ship's center elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck where armed and fueled aircraft were waiting for launch. Captain Taijiro Aoki watched in horror as his flagship, the pride of the combined fleet, was transformed into a floating inferno within minutes. The attack on Soryu was equally devastating. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadron from Yorktown had arrived at the same moment as McCluskey's Enterprise aircraft, their coordinated assault overwhelming the Japanese defenses. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto's carrier suffered multiple bomb hits that turned her flight deck into a twisted mass of steel and flame. Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, his face illuminated by the orange glow of fires that were rapidly consuming his fleet. The man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor now watched helplessly as American dive bombers completed their runs and climbed away into the Pacific sky. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's premier aircraft carriers had been reduced to burning hulks. The scene aboard the stricken carriers defied description. Explosions rocked the ships as ammunition detonated, sending debris high into the air. Sailors fought desperately to contain the fires, but the flames had taken hold of aviation gasoline and ordnance storage areas. Captain Jisaku Okada of Kaga gave the order to abandon ship at 11:40, realizing that his vessel was beyond salvation. Only the carrier Hiryu, positioned several miles north of her sister ships, escaped the initial American assault. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi embarked aboard Hiryu, immediately ordered his remaining aircraft to prepare for a counterattack. If Japan's fortunes in the Pacific were to be salvaged, Hiryu would have to accomplish alone what four carriers had failed to do. The rising sun was setting on Japanese naval supremacy. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the carrier. Hiryu, black smoke from his burning sister ships staining the horizon behind him. At 51 years of age, Yamaguchi was considered one of Japan's most capable naval commanders, a man whose tactical brilliance had been forged in the crucible of the China conflict and refined through months of Pacific conquest. Now, with 3/4 of Admiral Nagumo's striking force destroyed, the fate of the entire operation rested on his shoulders. All available aircraft will launch immediately, Yamaguchi commanded, his voice carrying the steel determination of a samurai facing his final battle. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi's 18 Aichi D3 of Aldive bombers and 60 fighters represented the last offensive capability of the Japanese carrier force. Their target, the American carrier Yorktown, which had been spotted by reconnaissance aircraft maintaining position northeast of the battle area. At 11:58, Kobayashi's formation lifted off from Hiryu's flight deck, the carrier steaming into the wind at maximum speed to provide optimal launching conditions. The Japanese pilots knew they were flying into overwhelming odds. American fighter patrols had been reinforced following the morning's attacks, and the element of surprise that had served the Imperial Navy so well was now lost forever. Captain Elliot Buckmaster's USS Yorktown had been busy recovering aircraft from the morning strikes when radar operators detected the incoming Japanese formation. General quarters, all hands to battle stations, echoed throughout the carrier as watertight doors slammed shut, and damage control parties took their positions. The ship that had been hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea was about to face her sternest test. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch's Fighting Squadron 3 rose to meet the Japanese attack, their Grumman F-4F Wildcats climbing rapidly to intercept altitude. Thatch's innovative weave defensive formation had proven effective against the nimble Zeros, and his pilots were eager to test their tactics against Japan's veteran aviators. The aerial battle that erupted above the American task force was a deadly symphony of tracers, engine noise, and exploding aircraft. Kobayashi's dive bombers pressed through intense anti-aircraft fire, their discipline and training evident as they maintained formation despite mounting losses. The first bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck at 12:10. Penetrating to the fourth deck before exploding near the ship's radar plotting room. 2 more bombs found their mark within minutes. The second bomb destroyed Yorktown's uptakes, filling her engineering spaces with choking smoke and reducing her speed to 6 knots. The third bomb started fires among aircraft parked on the hangar deck, threatening to repeat the devastation that had consumed the Japanese carriers earlier that morning. Captain Buckmaster's damage control parties performed miracles of seamanship and engineering. Within an hour, the fires were extinguished. Temporary repairs had restored the ship's speed to 20 knots, and Yorktown was operating aircraft as if nothing had happened. When the second Japanese strike wave, Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto's 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters arrived at 31, they found what appeared to be an undamaged American carrier. But Hashimoto's attack achieved what the dive bombers could not. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, flooding her engine rooms and causing a severe list that made further flight operations impossible. As the great carrier settled lower in the water, her crew prepared to abandon ship, their faces grim, but their spirits unbroken. Admiral Yamaguchi watched from Hiryu's bridge as reports filtered in from his strike leaders. The American carrier was damaged, possibly sinking, but the cost had been enormous. Of the 36 aircraft launched into strikes, fewer than 10 had returned. Japan's most experienced carrier pilots, irreplaceable veterans who had trained for years before the war, were lying beneath Pacific waves or floating in life rafts, waiting for rescue that might never come. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the battle-scarred ocean in shades of blood and gold. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Pacific battlefield, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the cruiser Northampton faced the most critical decision of his naval career. The morning's spectacular success had eliminated 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, but the enemy still possessed one operational flattop Hiryu and her position remained unknown. 2 American search aircraft. Lieutenant Samuel Adams launched from Enterprise at 3:30, leading a hastily organized strike of 24 Dauntless dive bombers and 8 Wildcat fighters. Their mission was simple yet vital: find and destroy the last Japanese carrier before she could launch additional strikes against the already damaged American fleet. The intelligence that Hiryu remained operational came from intercepted Japanese radio transmissions, but her exact location was a matter of educated guesswork. Aboard Hiryu, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi prepared his final gambit. His remaining aircraft, 5 Zero fighters, 4 Val dive bombers, and 6 Kate torpedo bombers represented the last offensive capability of the combined fleet's carrier striking force. The admiral understood that conventional tactics had failed. Only a desperate, all-or-nothing attack might salvage something from the disaster that had befallen the Imperial Navy. "We will attack the American carriers simultaneously," Yamaguchi informed his staff officers, his voice betraying none of the anguish he felt at the destruction of Japan's carrier force. "If we can damage their flight decks sufficiently, we may yet prevent them from pursuing our withdrawal." The reality was grimmer than Yamaguchi's optimistic assessment. Intelligence reports from the morning's reconnaissance flights indicated at least 2 American carriers remained operational, with fighter patrols that had grown stronger throughout the day. The handful of aircraft remaining aboard Hiryu faced impossible odds, yet Japanese naval doctrine demanded they attack regardless of the tactical situation. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher's Enterprise dive bombers found Hiryu at 5:45, the Japanese carrier steaming northward at maximum speed, while her escorts maintained tight formation around her. The sight below was eerily familiar: another Japanese flattop with aircraft spotted on deck. Another opportunity to demonstrate the devastating effectiveness of American dive bombing tactics, as documented by naval correspondent Robert Trumbull in his Pacific War Chronicles. The attack on Hiryu unfolded with the same precision that had characterized the morning's strikes. Gallagher's 1,000-pound bomb struck the carrier's forward elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck where it detonated among parked aircraft. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, flying his second mission of the day, scored another direct hit near the island's superstructure. Within minutes, Hiryu was engulfed in the same type of gasoline-fed fires that had doomed her sister ships. Captain Tomio Kaku watched helplessly as his ship's damage control parties fought a losing battle against flames that spread rapidly through the vessel's aviation spaces. The carrier that had been Japan's last hope in the Central Pacific was transformed into another funeral pyre on the darkening ocean. Admiral Yamaguchi made his final decision as Hiryu's list increased, and her speed dropped to bare steerage way. At 7:15, he ordered all personnel who could be spared to abandon ship, but he himself would remain aboard. The admiral who had led Japan's carriers to victory after victory across the Pacific chose to share the fate of his flagship rather than face the shame of explaining the day's catastrophe to his superiors in Tokyo. Captain Kaku joined his admiral on Hiryu's bridge as the last boats pulled away from the burning carrier. To naval officers, products of Japan's greatest military tradition, stood together as their ship settled deeper into the Pacific swells. Their deaths would symbolize the end of Japanese naval supremacy and the beginning of a long, agonizing retreat across the ocean they had once dominated. The Battle of Midway was effectively over, for Japanese aircraft carriers lay beneath Pacific waves, taking with them the cream of Imperial Navy aviation and Japan's hopes for decisive victory. In the Central Pacific, the pre-dawn darkness of June 5, 1942, found Admiral Chester Nimitz in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, reading dispatches that would reshape the entire Pacific War. The Battle of Midway was over, and the results exceeded his most optimistic projections. For Japanese aircraft carriers had been sunk, along with a heavy cruiser and several destroyers. More importantly, Japan had lost approximately 300 aircraft and many of their most experienced pilots, losses that would prove irreplaceable as the war progressed. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito received the news of the Midway disaster in stunned silence. The combined fleet that had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami had suffered its first major defeat, and the implications were staggering. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of both Pearl Harbor and the Midway operation, found himself facing the consequences of a gamble that had failed catastrophically. The human cost of Japan's defeat was beyond calculation. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, the man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, survived Midway but was among the wounded evacuated from the burning Akagi. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leader of the first strike against Midway, was killed when his damaged bomber crashed during landing operations. Captain Jisaku Okada of Kaga went down with his ship, choosing death over the dishonor of explaining his vessel's loss for the United States. Midway represented vindication of the intelligence services that had broken Japanese naval codes and the tactical decisions that had positioned American carriers in the perfect ambush position. Admiral Raymond Spruance's calm leadership under pressure had been instrumental in the victory, while the courage of pilots like Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey had turned intelligence advantages into battlefield triumph. The strategic implications of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's defeat marked the end of their offensive capability in the Central Pacific and forced a defensive posture that would characterize the remainder of their war effort. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated through months of conquest, was shattered by American bombs falling on the decks of carriers that had once seemed untouchable. As reported in contemporary accounts by war correspondents, the battle also demonstrated the decisive importance of aircraft carriers in modern naval warfare. The battleships that had dominated naval thinking for generations were relegated to supporting roles, while the flat-tops and their air groups became the primary striking arm of the fleet. The age of the aircraft carrier had truly begun, written in fire and steel across Pacific waters. Captain Elliot Buckmaster's damaged Yorktown remained afloat until June 7th, when Japanese submarine I-168 delivered the torpedo that finally sent her to the bottom. Her loss was mourning for American forces, but it could not diminish the magnitude of their victory. One American carrier against for Japanese. The exchange rate spoke volumes about the tactical and technological advantages that would carry the United States to ultimate victory. The sun that rose over the Pacific on June 6, 1942, illuminated a fundamentally altered strategic landscape. Japan's carrier striking force, the instrument of their early war successes, lay beneath thousands of feet of Pacific water. The pilots, who had trained since childhood to serve their emperor, were gone, their expertise and experience impossible to replace in wartime conditions. Admiral Yamamoto's prediction that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant at Pearl Harbor had proven prophetic. The giant was now fully roused, armed with growing industrial might and tactical innovations that would carry American forces across the Pacific to Tokyo Bay. The Battle of Midway had tested Japan's pride and found it wanting destroyed on the altar of overconfidence and strategic miscalculation. The rising sun flag that had flown so proudly over for aircraft carriers on the morning of June 4th would never again dominate Pacific skies. In its place, the Stars and Stripes began a westward advance that would culminate 3 years later in Tokyo Harbor, where Japanese representatives would sign the documents of unconditional surrender aboard the battleship Missouri. Japan's pride had indeed been tested at Midway's final battleground, and in failing that test, the empire had sealed its own fate.